Welcome to an installment of the Legends Series interview. I'm Bob Rossman, and today I'll be interviewing Dr. D.J. Brademas, who's been selected as a 2005 American Academy Legend. Good morning, Jim.
Morning, Bob, and I want to thank you for agreeing to do this interview.
Well, you're welcome, and it's my pleasure to do so. Jim, you've been in the field of parks and recreation for over 35 years, having served both as an administrator and as an academician. Could you share with us some of your personal background and how you came to get into parks and recreation?
Well, I think it probably started when I was about 6 years old. I joined a gymnastics club called the Turner Hall in South Bend, Indiana. And then in school, from the 5th grade on, I played football, basketball, baseball, ran track in high school, football, track and basketball. So I had this long interest in sports and physical education. When I went to the University of Illinois, I enrolled in physical education. But about halfway through the semester, I learned about parks and recreation and Dr. Alan Sapora, who was quite a dynamic character. And I could see that there were some splendid opportunities in parks and recreation for management. And so I immediately switched into the recreation curriculum, which was the best decision I ever made, short of marrying my wife. And then I stayed in it for the rest of my career, literally.
Well, that's an interesting background. Could you talk a little bit about, as a youngster, you were involved in a lot of different recreational activities, and today we seem to cause our youngsters to have to specialize by getting into a specific activity. Could you talk a little bit about the difference between those two and the effect you think they may have on today's youngsters?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question. There's big differences. In my day and age as a youngster, we would go to the playground and literally spend the whole day there, getting involved in softball, volleyball, table games, ping pong, checkers, whatever it might be. And then as a superintendent of recreation for the Rockford Park District, that's the way we operated some 37 playgrounds. Now today, it's soccer clubs, cheerleading clubs, baseball clubs, softball clubs, tennis clubs, golf clubs, and the old style playground, I think, has gone by the boards in a lot of communities. Now, there are still some communities that operate the way I've described, but there's a big emphasis today on camps and specialized activities. Big difference.
Well, you had quite a variety of activities as a youngster, and as you've gone through life, could you share with us some of the things that you have concentrated on and the things you do now for your own recreation and leisure interests?
Well, my primary leisure interest right now is tennis, and I live in an active adult community in Tucson, Arizona, and I suppose there are about 500 of us who are in the tennis club there. We have about 25 courts. There's 4 swimming pools, four golf courses, several fitness centers, a magnificent library. So there are an abundance of leisure activities. And I pretty well concentrate on the libraries and tennis. So those are the things I enjoy the most now.
So this is really a great career. You can follow up your active working years with being a participant.
Right, and then I do volunteer work within the organization as well.
Good, good. Earlier you mentioned that Alan Sapora was influential in getting you into this field. Surely through your career you had some other mentors that have played an important role in helping you develop. Could you share with us who some of those people are and what kinds of contributions they may have made to your own career development?
Certainly. I think there are 3, perhaps. Professor Charles Brightbill, Dr. Alan Sapora, and Dr. Joe Bannon. Charles Brightbill and Dr. Sapora were my undergraduate teachers, and Charles Brightbill was my thesis advisor for my master's program. And Joe Bannon was instrumental in bringing me to the University of Illinois and joining the faculty there. So there are three dynamic individuals, all three of whom were of immense help to me.
Jim, you have had experience both as a practitioner as well as an academic. Could you share with us some of your observations about the differences between the two and how one may have contributed to your work in the other arena?
Well, as a practitioner, you're involved in the supervision of staff, budgeting, programming, public relations, all of those elements that you have to face virtually every day. The carryover from those experiences into the classroom is very significant. I felt that I had a very good handle on what students needed to know from going from the classroom into the field. So my experiences as a practitioner, I think, I hope, made me a much better teacher in the classroom.
Well, there's always the ongoing debate between practice and being in the academy. You seem to be saying that your work in the academy was well grounded by your experience as a practitioner. And
no question about it. Right.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Well, Jim, your career has really spanned over 3 decades. Could you talk a little bit about the changes you've observed in Parks and Recreation over that 3-decade-plus period?
I think the primary changes have been in funding, where in the old days, virtually all of our money came from tax funds, and there were very little fees and charges. Today, I talk with some department heads who tell me that their budgets are like 70% fees and charges and maybe 30% taxes. That's a very major difference, I think. The other difference is in programming. Again, this concentration on camps and on specialized activities, which in the earlier days, we didn't do that. Children just came to the playground and got involved in a myriad of activities without concentrating on any one in particular, unless it was baseball, a team effort. But I think those are the two major changes, the funding and the camps.
Okay, well, Jim, you've been selected to be a participant in the Legends series because of your significant accomplishments through your career. Could you share with us some of the accomplishments you're most proud of personally and those you think have been really most significant?
I think I'd like to mention two. One is the establishment of the Department of Recreation in the Rockford Park District. I had the really rare privilege of starting that department. In '54, I operated 4 playgrounds as an experiment in Rockford. If you can believe, this was a significant park district, population 150,000. I think it may have been the only city of that size in the United States that did not have a supervised recreation program. Their philosophy was flowers, fertilizer, and feeding the ducks. But they had no supervised recreation at 37 local playgrounds. So in '54, I managed 4 playgrounds as an experiment, came back in '55 and managed 10 playgrounds as an experiment. We were overwhelmed with the response. So in spring of '56, they went for a referendum to establish a recreation department within the park district. It passed by a huge majority. And fortunately, I was selected to be the first superintendent. And we put in 10, 12-hour days. The response was just so great that it was almost hard to keep up with the demand. of the public. It just seemed like they were, all of this energy was bottled up, and finally we were offering these programs, and they just overwhelmed us. Fortunately, I had a superb staff. Chuck Fiducia, who lived in Rockford, Don Ellis, who was an Illinois football player and lived in Rockford, Frank Lepton, whom you know, went on to
Sure.
become the department head at Western Illinois University, McKinley Deacon Davis, the great basketball player from Freeport, Illinois, and Helen Peterson. These were just absolutely superb people. We opened schools for recreation, which they said was just unheard of, and believed that the kids would tear the schools up. We had 5 schools open on Friday night for recreation. We turned out 5,000
Wow.
students every Friday night. We never had one instance of vandalism, not one. We opened up an outdoor education center in a woods about 10 miles out of town, with a dormitory for boys, a dormitory for girls, and 2 apartments for teachers, and a huge classroom. And we would take 6th graders out there from Monday through Friday, and they would learn nature, geology, science in that setting. Very successful program. They tell me it still goes on, as does the school program, and that
That's wonderful.
they're getting students from as far away as suburbs of Chicago. Another thing we did, which was a little bit unprecedented in those days, we opened 2 playgrounds, one on the east side, one on the west side, and let it be known that disabled children were welcome
Really?
to come. This is now 1957. Again, the response was just tremendous. And some people told us, these things are not going to work, Brademas. I said, well, we'll take a chance, we'll see. And fortunately, they worked. So that was one. The second program that I got heavily involved in was the Illinois Rural Recreation Development Project, where we went into small towns of under 5,000 population in Illinois, usually 1,300 people, 2,000 people, and did an 8-week summer recreation program for children 6 to 13 years of age. We took our best recreation majors as directors who lived in that town for 10 weeks, housing provided by the community. We paid them $3,000. And then we recruited teenagers from that town and brought them to campus and trained them as recreation leaders, who went back and served as assistants to our director. So the director had to work with the Citizens Advisory Committee, the mayor, council, had to do publicity, had to do programming, had to supervise their recreation leaders, had to do all of the things that you would do in any major system. So they got a tremendous background in administration. And those students went on to get jobs fairly easily. So I'm told that up till now we've done 35 towns, and that 14 are on their own.
Oh, that's very good.
Without any help from the university. And of course, that's the ultimate goal, is to get the local community to adopt the program, pay for it, and run it on their own. So it's still going on.
That's great, and those are really 2 major contributions. I just want to follow up a little bit so our viewers sure realize that in the 50s is when most park and recreation departments were being combined, and in many cases recreation programs and operations were being placed into park departments who were somewhat skeptical about whether this was all going to work. So the work you did in Rockford was very pioneering work, establishing how these units may fit into traditional park districts and have a role to play. And so I thank you for sharing that with us.
By the way, one of my playground directors in '55 eventually went on to become the director in Rockford, Webbs
Really?
Norman, who's been there about 33 years.
Wow, so you've also been a mentor in your career to a number of people who've gone on to succeed as well. I also wanted to observe about how you go about developing program services. You do all the classic things that we teach in a classroom to make a program successful in the short run as well as the long haul. That includes hiring indigenous leaders, having community-based advisory committees. I know in your Illinois Rural Recreation Project, you got the governor's wife, the governor of the state's wife, to serve both as a financier and on your board of directors. So you do all the classic things that we teach, and your programs succeed initially, and some of them have been around for 25 to 30 years. So that's quite an accomplishment. Jim, as you look at young people today, and you've been both a practitioner and you've been in a university helping prepare young people, what kinds of skills and abilities do you think is most essential that we teach and that our students make some effort to learn and master to become successful park and recreation administrators?
Well, I think there are several skills. One is writing, the ability to write. I think young people should take every opportunity they can to write and have their writing critiqued, because once you get on the job and your boss asks you to write a report or to write a grant request, you better be prepared to be able to do it properly with correct grammar and cohesive sentences structure. So writing, I think, is essential. And speaking, public speaking. Take every opportunity you can to speak to groups, no matter how small or how large, no matter the setting. If you have an opportunity to speak to a group, particularly about recreation, do it. Another skill that I think is absolutely necessary is to have the ability to recruit and select the right person for the job. And in that respect, I've been very, very lucky. In addition to that, once you do select the right people for the job, you listen to their ideas, you critique with them, you work out the details, then you turn them loose and say, go do it. And you don't micromanage, you don't look over their shoulder, you let them go with it. And when they're successful, as they usually are, you give them maximum credit. You give them all the credit for the good work that they've done. And finally, you have to have the skill or ability to let people go, to fire people if in fact they're not producing. And that takes some courage to do that as well.
It sure does, and I know you've spent a part of your career working on personnel selection, so I'm not sure it's a matter of luck for you. I think it's an ability that you've actually developed over time, and I know you're very good at that, so I always appreciated watching you do that. Jim, you've been retired for several years now. How do you keep up with the field? What kinds of things do you do to keep up with Park and Recreation Administration?
Well, I'm still a member of the Illinois Park and Recreation Association. I'm still a member of NRPA, and I'm on a team for accreditation of universities, and I've done several, and I'm now on a team for accreditation of agencies, and I worked on Scottsdale this past year. So in that respect, I read the journals and I'm trying to keep up with what's going on. And I've attended every national congress except the one in St. Louis over the past 5 years. So I try to keep up that way.
Well, we appreciate that. It seems like you're keeping up and you can continuing to contribute as well. So that's very good. You've got a lot of wisdom and many years' experience that you bring to these endeavors, and we certainly appreciate that. Jim, I know that over your career you've also done a lot of international travel, particularly to Greece. Could you share with us some of the things you've learned in your travels to Greece and what kinds of observations you may have made comparing recreation and leisure in Greek society versus the United States?
My father was born and raised in Greece, in Kalamata, where the great olives and olive oil come from, and came to this country when he was 21. In 55, I went to Athens and as a Fulbright teacher and taught at the Athens YMCA for 10 months. I made a couple of other short trips back after that, but in 1986 I went back for 6 months and did a study of the public leisure service systems, delivery systems in Greece by traveling the mainland and 5 islands, interviewing public officials in all of these different towns to find out what the Greek governments were doing in the way of providing public parks and recreation for the Greek people. I was not interested in tourism. Mostly it was youth soccer clubs.
Really?
Yes, that's where the big concentration was. Very few playgrounds, very few activities other than sports.
Do they have soccer clubs for girls as well?
Not that I recall.
Not that you recall?
No, it was mostly for the boys. I thought it was a pretty limited program all in all, and of course I wrote all this up and left it with the Minister of Education.
So was the effort mostly at the municipal, do they have state government, or at the federal level? Where was the initiative?
Mostly municipal.
Mostly municipal.
Right. They were just a little bit behind. And then I went back in, that was 86, I went back in 1993 for 5 months. I had discovered senior citizen centers, which I thought was a rarity in Greece because of the patriarchal society, and that coffee houses, kaphenians, are where the men congregate and the women are not allowed. And here I saw some senior citizen centers where men and women were socializing. So I went back in 93 and did a 30-minute video documentary on senior citizen centers and became an honorary member of one of the senior citizen centers and participated in their activities. I had a great time. And my last trip was in 99, where I did some consultation with the Agricultural University of Athens on rural recreation. I'm going back in October next month for a month to photograph as many Olympic sites as I can get to, and to say hello and goodbye to some of my relatives. So I've had some great times in Greece.
Well, that's good. And so overall, what would you say, or how important is the role of recreation and leisure in Greek life compared to in the United States?
I would say it is not nearly as important, except for young boys. But other than that, it's not at all like the United States, where you have our magnificent park systems and public recreation systems.
Well, speaking about the systems, as you look at and observe what's going on now, and you've been out on some of the accreditation reviews for community parks and recreation agencies, how do you see the future of parks and recreation, particularly municipal parks and recreation in the United States?
Well, I think it's very good, although funding is always a major problem. Yet here in Tucson, about a mile from my house is a brand new $14 million linear park that's being built. And in a community called Morena, which is right next door to Tucson, they're proposing a $55 million park. You look at Cleveland Metro Parks, they've passed 2 enormous referendums. We're talking multi-millions of dollars. So I think things look very good on the municipal level, that people more and more are beginning to see the tremendous importance of parks. And industry looks at a lot of things when they want to go into a community, but 2 things in particular. One is the quality of the education system, And the other is the quality of the park and recreation system. Are there things for our employees to become involved in? So I think the future looks very good.
Good. And speaking of the future, I know that you were involved in internship placement for students at the University of Illinois, and so you've spent some time helping young people and mentoring them into how to begin their careers. What advice would you give young people who might come and say, well, Dr. Brademas, I'd really like to get in this field. What should I do? What should I be doing to get in and succeed?
Well, I urged my students from day one in class to go to a public park and recreation system. If you want to have a first-class internship experience, that's where you should go. I know that the sports management majors, they all want to go with the Bears and the White Sox and the Cardinals. Very difficult to get internships in those major sports. Much easier to get internships in the minor leagues, although you may end up painting bleachers.
Sure.
And making phone calls 8 hours a day to sell tickets, which I don't feel is
They do a lot of marketing activities too in those.
It's very rewarding internship. But if a student is interested in sports management, which many of them are, I tell them, look, go into any major park district, and they have superb sports and athletic programs where you can learn how to manage that kind of a system. Stay away from resorts, which I don't think are particularly good. So all in all, I think public park and recreation systems offer the best internships.
Okay, so they have a more comprehensive set of operations.
Absolutely.
and therefore give the students a little more of a
Absolutely.
comprehensive experience. Speaking of community parks and recreation, I know that you have done some work with the role and function of community advisory boards. Could you talk a little bit about their role and function that you've observed? And I know you've done some research and
Sure.
writing in this area.
Sure. Again, back to the Rockford experience, where we formed a neighborhood advisory committee around every playground. And if there was a problem, these people joined together to solve that problem. When it came to the referendum to establish a department, those people were very, very significant from those neighborhood associations in getting out the vote. In the rural recreation project, we made it mandatory that every community would have to form a citizens committee to serve as an advisor to our student director, and for the director to turn to that advisory committee if they needed something, whether it was a movie projector or tables or whatever. And so I've always felt very, very strongly about the importance of advisory committees.
Well, it's as you've demonstrated with the success you've had in some of these programs, it's very important to keep connected on an ongoing basis, not just when you've got a referendum
Right.
vote or you need something from
Right.
them. You've got to keep them engaged over the long haul.
Right. Exactly right.
And you've always done that. That's been very good. Jim, about Parks and Recreation, what do you see as one of the biggest needs that public parks and recreation have right now?
Well, probably funding, which
Yes.
is, again, usually a problem. The ability of communities to secure land when the opportunity comes up. I think the major problems nationally, I think, are with our national parks, where this administration said they were going to fully finance the national parks. They have not done that. As a matter of fact, there's a 194-page report that just came out emphasizing the commercialization, the commerce in parks with snowmobiles, jet skis, over-the-terrain vehicles, and religious items in the gift shops. I mean, it's absolutely incredible that the administration would even think in those kinds of terms, but they are. And I've just completed a tour of 5 national parks, and I cannot picture those snowmobiles and jet skis and all of that business going on in the national parks. But
so just to set this interview in time, this is done in 2005, and so that would be the George W. Bush administration. That's the administration you're referring to.
that's correct.
Yes. And so the commercialization, and I assume this is to generate a revenue stream that was not there before, but you're concerned about its impact on the overall experience and what's supposed to happen in national parks?
Obviously. I think it would ruin the national parks if that sort of thing were allowed.
But regarding municipal parks and recreation, you think we have a pretty good formula, and things are going pretty well?
I think so, but I think at the same time that the public has to be pretty vigilant and realize what's going on. I know that's the case, and certainly in Tucson, that people are very aware of what's going on. This $14 million linear park was proposed with soccer fields and a lot of sports fields. And the public came out and said, no, we don't want that. We want a passive area. We want equestrian areas. We want outdoor education areas. We don't want major soccer fields. And they changed the layout of the park.
Well, that's very interesting, because usually your youth soccer associations are very large and very powerful. So that's quite a change, but the people spoke and they were listened to.
That's exactly right.
That's good. You know, setting this again in the time frame in which this interview was done, the nation's recovering from the devastation of Hurricane Katrina. It's been about 10, 12 days now since the hurricane actually struck. From your observations, what kind of a role has Parks and Recreation played in that, and what kind of a role do you see in general that Parks and Recreation plays when these kinds of disasters do strike?
Well, I think they can play a role depending, where these disasters strike. Right now, there are so many agencies stumbling over each other to provide services for these people, which I think is great. I think the coordination is not too good. I don't really see Parks and Recreation at this point getting involved unless more of these evacuees start coming north, where they may utilize Park and Recreation facilities to house them, perhaps, for temporary periods. Like the Tucson Convention Center is now open for about 1,000 of these evacuees coming into Tucson. So it's possible that the local Park and Recreation Agency can provide some services to the children and perhaps adults who are stuck in these places and need some energy and need some activity. That's where I see perhaps our Park and Recreation agencies could play a role.
Sure. And usually Park and Recreation agencies have considerable amount of equipment, like front-end loaders, dump trucks, and those kinds of things. But I've also noticed on TV that one of the first things that happens in the shelters is they're trying to get recreation activities going, particularly for the youngsters that are there. So certainly we have a role to play in this. Jim, if someone come up and say, hey, I knew D. James Brademas, what would you like them to conjure up in their mind as an image of your legacy and what you contributed? What would be the end of that sentences of what has Jim Brademas contributed to Parks and Recreation?
Well, I hope somebody says he did some good and he did it with some integrity. And I think that's about the best you can hope for, and that some students out there may be saying, I learned something from that guy.
I think there'll be a lot of students saying that. Your contributions have always been done with integrity, and I've always appreciated that about you.
It's been great fun.
Fun. Well, you know, fun's what we're all about, and
Right.
you obviously have enjoyed your career tremendously.
Very much.
And seem to be enjoying your retirement, hopefully from some of the skills you picked up during your
much.
career.
Right.
Jim, have you got any other comments or observations you would like to make before we bring this to a close?
Well, I might close with a proverb from Socrates, particularly for those young students out there. He said, "Takala kopis katunde," which means things of value come only after hard work.
Good advice in all fields.
Right.
Certainly. Jim, on behalf of the American Academy for Park and Recreation Administration, I want to thank you for sharing your career with us today and providing some insights for our viewers about how to succeed and how the field is going.
Good. Thank you, Bob, very much.
Thank you. This concludes our interview with Dr. D. James Brademas, a 2005 American Academy legend. Thank you and good day.